the apples that he was growing, they weren't the sweeter kind of apples. They were the more tart apples that really you would only use to make alcohol. And so this article was calling him the American Dionysus because really he was not just supplying apples, it was more of he was supplying alcohol to the American West. Is there any reality to that? Hi, I'm Ayla Sparks, and this is Curator's Choice, a podcast for history nerds and museum lovers. From ancient relics to modern marvels, each episode of this show features a new museum and a curator's choice of some amazing artifacts housed there. These guardians of history will share insights, anecdotes, and the often untold stories that breathe life into the artifacts they protect. Thanks for tuning in to this Mighty Oak Media production, and enjoy the show. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Curator's Choice. Today on the show, we're at the Johnny Appleseed Education Center and Museum in Urbana, Ohio. With Michaela Prescott as our guide, we'll be exploring the man, the possible myths, and the apple legend himself, John Chapman. Join us as we explore the life of this apple orchard entrepreneur and his often omitted missionary work done in the name of the Swedenborgian faith. Who was he really? Tin hat or no tin hat? Barefoot man walking through the woods or brilliant-minded apple orchardist? A small disclaimer for this episode: a historical text will be discussed, which includes mention of certain conjugal relations, so listener discretion is advised. So, without further ado, let's jump right in with Michaela. Have you always been in love with Johnny Appleseed?
Oh, absolutely not. So I grew up in the central Pennsylvania area. So Johnny Appleseed was a thing, but his existence was pretty much, we had a Johnny Appleseed Day in school growing up.
I remember having one of those.
Yeah, what that equated to was we got to eat sliced apples and peanut butter, and we usually did a craft where we colored in the tin pot hat and stapled it to a headband. That was it. He was never contextualized beyond that. This is my favorite thing. When we get tours in, I always ask them what feels like dumb questions. Have you ever heard of him? Those sorts of things. And more I'm seeing, especially younger groups who are like, oh, he's not a real person. And then they get really embarrassed. And I'm like, no, he's a real person. And part of that for me is I like to soothe their fears and be like, I did not know he was a real person until I was in college.
But to be fair, I mean, Johnny Appleseed really is he's got a real myth and legend aura about him, right? A tin saucepan on his head, running around planting seeds in the American Manifest Destiny. It just seems like it would fit really well that it's one of our urban legends.
Yeah, he does fit super well within urban legends. He's even gone so far as in the book American Gods by Neil Gaiman, he's mentioned amongst other gods of antiquity as an American god, as a member of our religious ranks. That adds fuel to the fire in this sort of idea that he's not a real person, especially when he's getting categorized with Paul Bunyan. Was Paul Bunyan real? I'm sure there was a cool guy at some point who was really strong and did cut down trees. Did he have a blue ox? Was he pulling up railroads or whatever he was doing?
Don't ruin this for me.
But Johnny Appleseed gets lumped into that same category. The largest part of what we do in the museum is sort of untangling that. We're not as concerned with forcing people to remember Johnny Appleseed's real name was John Chapman. He was born September 26, 1770. We're not as concerned with people remembering those hard dates and facts so much as we really want them to go through the museum and leave with a better understanding of how history gets done, using those critical thinking skills. When I tell you, the source of this story, this thing we've always believed, came from someone who was 7 years old. How does that frame your understanding of this source? Are you sure you want to trust it the whole way? So that's sort of our bigger goal in our education, less to make you memorize his siblings' names and memorize every town he stopped in so much as, okay, so why did I come here thinking this wasn't a real person? And how can I sort of use my knowledge better in the future? How did we go from this guy who was very much of his life and times and era and an incredible person, but the apple thing is really sort of the least interesting thing about him, to that's 100 years after his death in the 1930s and 40s, there's a sudden explosion in interest of this This homeless vagabond, no shoes, throwing apple seeds, pet wolf, pot hat, he just sort of comes out of nowhere. 100 years after his death, suddenly overnight, he goes from being no one to being this folk hero. It's really rewarding.
Well, so now that we've established he absolutely existed. And at one point in time, he was a 7-year-old and a 14-year-old and a 30-year-old. So who was Johnny Appleseed? Brief history of this
Yeah.
guy's life.
Yeah, I'll run you through like the most bare bones crash course. So Johnny Appleseed, real name, John Chapman. He's born September 26th, 1774 in Leominster, Massachusetts. That makes, at the time of recording this, next month would have been his 250th birthday.
Oh, wow.
He's born to his mother, Elizabeth, and his father, Nathaniel. His mother dies when he's very young. His father remarries, has a bunch more kids. And so John Chapman, being a bit, not quite involved with the family at this point, as a young man, goes to Pennsylvania. He leaves Massachusetts and he walks through New York and into Pennsylvania. Most importantly, he stops in the Pittsburgh area. And this is where he learns the two sort of pillars of his personhood, which is he learns the trade of portraiting and he learns about his Swedenborgian religion. This is where he's sort of introduced to his religion. Now, when we're talking about this character everybody knows and loves, we've come away with this idea that he just eats apples because he likes them and he's spitting seeds and doesn't realize there's a forest growing behind him everywhere he goes. Not at all.
Yeah, he was very deliberate.
He was incredibly deliberate. He was actually a quite intelligent businessman when we consider the U.S. government essentially is saying, hey, soldiers, we can't pay you with money, but what we can pay you with is all this territory we just won, again, in loose quotes there. They believed they had won fair and square. And so they're rewarding these plots of lands with the stipulation that people need to have apple trees on it, especially. And so we're actually interacting with a very brave and intelligent character who can see the writing on the wall and says, in another decade's time, the hottest item on the market is about to be apples. So if I'm there first and I'm planting before everyone else, guess who's going to need me? Everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, the large big picture of Johnny Appleseed in the legend does take place in Ohio. He spent about 20 to 30 years of his life circulating around the Ohio area. It's debatable about whether or not he jumped over into like the West Virginia area, into the Kentucky area, but he definitely crossed back and forth in the Pittsburgh area, all around Ohio for 20 to 30 years, hitting about every corner of the state before finally Ohio's pretty well done and he moves into the Indiana area, and he doesn't make it very far before he passes away in Fort Wayne, Indiana, March 18th, 1845. So that's sort of a crash course in this historical figure. And what you really need to know is also along the way, he's not only doing the apple thing, he is spreading his religion, Swedenborgianism, which I touched on. He was introduced to this in the area of Pittsburgh. That's another part of him that gets left behind in the grander mythos. If we look at Walt Disney's Melody Time, which was a short film, a lot of people recall it like Mandela Effect, recall it being a full-length film. It wasn't. It was just 18 minutes long. About Johnny Appleseed is they touch on the fact that he's religious. He has a guardian angel, but they conveniently sort of neglect to mention what that religion is or what that means to him. But when we're looking at John Chapman and studying him, he's really devout in his religion. They consider him a missionary for the Swedenborgian faith because he was taking this not very well understood, complex religion and introducing it into the state of Ohio and sort of making it digestible, because Swedenborgianism is a really complex religion that had new ideas. It was opening a lot of doors. It was very strange. And so he's planting apple trees and also bringing this sort of fringe, strange religion into pockets of remote Ohio, which is it's just fascinating. Like I said, the apple thing is actually not very interesting at all when we consider all this. That was just a good business plan to do apples. But for some reason, that's the thing we sort of keep up with in modern times is he did the pot hat thing and he had apples. And the pot hat thing isn't even true. So,
Wasn't it the only record that we really have of that is one person wrote it down after meeting him at one point. She was an author and wrote an article and put that in the article. And that's where everyone else got their information about the pot hat from.
yeah, so pretty much the pot hat thing it's very strange when we sort of track it down. I have my own theory about this. This podcast might get people ruffled. I don't know. This is still very hotly debated in Johnny Appleseed fan circles. Is pot hat or not pot hat? What we do know is he was a really big storyteller. There are many records where he loved interacting with kids and telling them stories about the wilderness and all of his adventures and sort of doing anything he could to get them to laugh, giving them ribbons for his hair, poking his feet with needles just to sort of entertain them. It is incredibly possible at one point in time he put a pot on his head, and for some reason that's the thing that sticks. But when we're actually looking at like, oh, this is what he was doing all the time, I'm so sorry to report that like we don't really have any record of that. The only record we have when they talk about his headgear is Rosella Rice, who's a girl living in the Mansfield, Ohio area. She knew Johnny quite well. He planted for her grandparents and her parents, so he was living on their property for a good number of years. She talks about him wearing a pasteboard hat, which is similar modern idea, cardboard. And what she describes is actually kind of the modern day baseball hat. So in my mind, it's actually way more interesting to think about this character in the early 1800s wearing a baseball cap that he made. But I'm not the one who got to decide which part stuck. It would bring a lot more images to mind when we think about this pot hat, but probably not true. This is something that just gets said sort of offhanded once and then gets passed around forever. In the course of the legend, people are trying to find ways to make that make sense and sort of rationalize it. He wore a pot on his head because he was kicked in the head by a horse when he was young, and this was something about trepanning, holding his brain together. Well, he was wearing the tin pot on his head to protect his head from apples that were falling in the orchard. If he's planting them from seed, he's probably not spending a whole lot of time getting hit in the head with apples. Well, it keeps the sun out of his eyes. If that pot on the head is what makes someone remember, love, invest in, and uplift this history, then you can keep your pot hat. Like, if that's the thing that it takes to get you interested in history and local history especially, then keep it. That's fine.
Chapman himself, he was obviously a missionary. He was a nurseryman or an orchardist, maybe we could even say. He was really, really big into nature, conservationist. He was also a vegetarian?
Okay, so this is another one of those tricky traps that sort of is confusing. So when we're talking about conservationist, we sort of have to wonder what that means. And we have the duty of always meeting people where they're at when looking at biographical figures as people in their era and of their time. One of these challenges when we sort of label him a conservationist and we think about our 21st century idea of, chain yourself to the oak tree on campus so they don't cut it down, recycle all your plastics and your aluminum cans and turn off your water. And not really. Chapman actually makes a lot of money on the side logging for people because this was one of the things you needed to do to claim your land was making improvements, which was sort of a big catch-all term. And one of the ways you could achieve that goal is clearing out old growth forests for your orchards and for cattle, making fences, things like this. So when we're talking about conservationist, it's really dangerous to lump him into that idea of world-class environmentalist by today's standards. But if we want to speak about him as a figure who he's not interested in building apartment complexes in the woods, if that's what we're talking about, he meets that bare minimum quality, and he isn't interested in indigenous warfare. He's not interested in seeing indigenous people removed from their lands. He is a vegetarian, asterisk, which is to say he was eating what people offered him. So if he was offered ye old burger, old-timey burger, he would eat it. But he wasn't known for going hunting on his own. We know he bought a gun. We know he bought gunpowder. We have receipts that prove this. But we also have these firsthand accounts that date to him saying, well, I have to have a gun because I'm walking around in the woods. But he didn't feel like he had the liberty to take the life of a creature. it goes back to those very strict religious beliefs. He believed that God was in everything, and that included animals, which meant he didn't really feel like it was his decision or call to go hunting and take the life of something if God intended for that creature to be wild and free and living. So conservationist by modern day standards, maybe not, but still sort of anachronistic within his own time period and people's understanding, so therefore unique. Absolutely.
And it sounds a lot more like conservationist back then was more of nature lover and nature preferer.
And we again also have to look at that as like we're looking at all these different folks' motivations to moving out west, getting their own land. It was rough living. It's hard work, it's sweaty work, it's heavy labor, and it's not for everyone. And so we're looking at a very unique figure that, by all accounts, seems just as comfortable, if not more comfortable, with this sort of nomadic lifestyle, camping out, living in the woods, squatting on lands, living in people's barns or sheds or cellars for a hot minute. It is very interesting. It's like that one friend you have at college who's always traveling somehow. And you're like, how are you always in a hostel over in Japan and then next week camping in Saskatchewan? Like, how do you do that? It does take a very certain interesting personality, I think, to be of that sort of be totally at ease, even though you don't have a place to return to at home, sort of no home base. It is very fascinating to me that he never has a home where we can say, oh, John Chapman lived here, and here was his address, and here was his house. He was living with whoever he was planting for. He was living with his half-sister and her husband for a while. So it is a very interesting person that I can see why he would sort of cut a sort of familiar form that people would recall him so many years later. I comprehend it.
Well, and continuing on with this idea that we have a lot of thoughts about Johnny Appleseed, the tin hat and running around barefoot, which apparently he did run around barefoot, but not because he just wanted to feel the dirt on his feet. He was just kind of this,
Shoes are
conservationist
expensive.
nomad. But the idea of him just walking and spitting apple seeds also is very inaccurate. As we had mentioned earlier, he was a nursery man. So the way that he was able to kind of be an entrepreneur in this new burgeoning apple orchard space was by creating these nurseries. How did he go about making these successful?
Yeah, so here's another thing that people leave out of the story. He is buying and claiming parcels of land in Ohio, especially. So the way he's getting started is he's crossing back over into that Pittsburgh area, which is where I said he first encountered the orchardist sort of hobby or career path. We believe we've got it narrowed down to a location called Metzgerville, the Metzgerville Cider Press. When people are making apple cider, you're more or less crushing and squeezing these apples into an applesauce texture and draining the juice from it. What that leaves behind is what we call pumice. It's all the stems and twigs and leaves and skin and cores and seeds. And so he essentially strikes up this deal that he's like, well, you're not going to use the seeds for anything anyways. Give me all that garbage. So he's more or less dumpster diving in a sense that he's taking all this refuse from the cider making process. He's literally picking the seeds out of it and then carrying them back across the border to this land he's purchased, planting them there, and returning to Pennsylvania, getting more seeds, planting for someone else. And so when we think about his journey and this sort of idea that it was a really linear path he walked, not at all. He's returning to places year after year, these orchards that he is maintaining and keeping a tab on. And he's returning because he needs more seeds, more trees. He always has to constantly be moving forward and having those branch campuses to get more material. That's how he keeps moving west, by returning east from time to time.
Well, and the way that he ended up making some of his money as well, right, was he would have this nursery established for a few years, and then would he sell off chunks of the nursery, or would he actually like dig up trees and transport the trees and people would purchase those?
So he would eventually sell a lot of this land. Mostly what people were requesting from him, he would plant from seed for, I believe, I hope I'm not misquoting this, a fit petty bit. You could, slightly more expensive, you could buy an actual whip from him, which is this like younger tree. But for the most part, when he's doing large orchards further out west, he's planting from seed. Apple trees and apples are notoriously slow growers. These little trees take about 4 to 5 years to flower, another 8 to 10 before you're getting good apples from them. Depending on when people are coming to their land, their need for trees might be more emergent. So you could pay John Chapman a little extra, and he would bring you already growing trees rather than planting the seed for you. We don't necessarily see his orchards totally dissolve or turn into mist and smoke, but he does sell off these parcels of land. He is constantly buying and selling land. He'll buy this and he'll plant it and he'll have it for a couple years and then he'll sell it back off, sort of always changing hands.
When I also read that he didn't do grafting, which is one of the ways that in modern times, that's how you shorten how long it takes for an apple tree to actually make apples. It makes the process a lot quicker. But he wasn't a fan of grafting. So instead, the apples that he was growing, they weren't the sweeter kind of apples. They were the more tart apples that really you would only use to make alcohol. And so this article was calling him the American Dionysus because really he was not just supplying apples, it was more of he was supplying alcohol to the American West. Is there any reality to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll break this down into a couple of different hot points here. First and foremost, people will say, oh, he didn't graft because of his religion. His religion was so bizarre, they wouldn't let him graft because that would be like tampering in God's domain. That's not really true. He didn't graft, but the reason was probably not religiously motivated. It's a very good explanation. It's a great stab at an explanation. Most likely we're looking at more convenience. If you've got to plant 100 trees dozens of miles away, would you rather drag 100 baby trees with you or an envelope full of apple seeds? The large purpose behind grafting today is so you can grow those sweeter apples. Every apple we see at a grocery store today, your Red Delicious, your Gala, your Pink Lady, your Honey Crisp, your Jazz Apple, your Cosmic Crisp, those are all more or less clones of one another. They are, you get a tree, you really like how it turned out, and you're grafting. You're cutting off those limbs and basically bandaging them to what are called rootstock, a different type of tree, to trick that rootstock into growing more of this kind of apple. Johnny Appleseed wasn't setting out to plant snacking apples like you already sort of prefaced. He wasn't setting out to create the next Pink Lady apple. He was planting what we call spitters. To say an apple is a spitter is like saying a dog in a shelter is a mutt. You walk into a dog shelter and you're like, oh, that looks a lot like a Labrador retriever. And the shelter will be like, nope, it's a mutt. Because we can't prove it's a Labrador. So we're just going to call it a mutt. So he's not planting Rambo apples. He's not planting Granny Smith apples. Did he have favorite apples that he liked to eat? Probably. But what he's actually planting are all these nasty mutt apples, which are more or less similar to a crab apple. They're sort of oblong, they're sort of green, and they're sandy, and they're really bitter and quite sour. This is where they get their name, spitter, because they were so bitter that you would take a bite and want to spit it back out. But if what all these apples are being used for is feeding hogs, making vinegar to can and preserve your winter stock, or making alcohol, who cares how they taste? And this alcohol thing is another piece that sort of gets conveniently scrubbed from the real history. A lot of that has to do with Johnny Appleseed's characterization really becoming popular in the zeitgeist in these 1930s and 40s. We're still very much coming off of prohibition and these moral crusades against alcohol and how alcohol is evil. So it sort of gets scrubbed out of the story, but he's not moonshining. Johnny Appleseed's not moonshining for people. What he's doing is he's providing them apples. That way they can make alcoholic apple cider. That way they have something safe to drink. This is the government's big plan of why they're telling people you've got to plant apples, you've got to plant apples, you've got to plant apples, because they want people to have something to drink. This is when I'm talking about we have our tours teaching them how we're doing history and putting the pieces together using critical thinking is everyone can turn on the tap at their house and drink it. It might not taste good if you're on well water or something, but you're probably not going to die from it. In Johnny Appleseed's day, dysentery is a huge killer. If you want water, you're going to a local stream and you're really hoping that you're upstream of the farmer who has his cows peeing and pooping in that same stream. you're safer to drink alcohol than you are water at this point. So everyone needs a little bit of alcohol just to stay safe and hydrated. When we're talking about they're scrubbing this part of the story out, we don't want him to be this American Dionysus. We don't want him to bring alcohol to the West. We don't want him bringing these impurities to these like beautiful pioneers who are accomplishing manifest destiny. It's misconstrued by our modern understandings of alcohol and alcoholism, and we sort of have tossed out and forgotten how imperative having something safe to drink is when we don't have bureaucratic entities monitoring waterways and water systems and making sure things are safe to drink. How important it is that someone does have something safe to drink at that time. So it's kind of a shame that it gets left out of the story, but there's been like a reinvigorated interest in like, wait a second, was Johnny Appleseed kind of the bad boy of the American West? Was he moonshining? Not at all. He's a very smart businessman, and he sort of sees that writing on the wall. If people are going to need these apples to make this cider, that way they can keep their land, and that way they have something to drink in the future.
Speaking of these immoral acts of bringing alcohol but just reading from the title.
Are you talking about conjugal love?
Yes.
Okay, so don't feel silly. I'm about to take you on such a trip with conjugal love.
I'm ready.
Okay.
It just sounds dirty. And I was like, I am very interested in finding out what this means.
So this is one of the reasons when you go on our website and you see the things we're purporting, we're like, oh, surely this is Curator's Choice. Surely she's going to talk about, his Bible. No, I want to talk about this book instead, which is hilarious. I actually got so anxious because I was like 100% certain I knew what I was going to say. And then I was like, you know what? I've got to call in an expert. So before we met, I actually called a minister for the Swedenborgian faith. I called in some favors to be like, hey, I need you to break this down for me one more time. So we have this book called Conjugal Love. To explain it, we have to remember that Johnny Appleseed was a very devout Swedenborgian. Swedenborgianism is started by this guy named Emanuel Swedenborg. And here's your crash course in sort of Emanuel Swedenborg. He actually doesn't really he's a theologian, he's sort of a philosopher, he's an inventor, he's the son of a minister, and he doesn't really intend to start a religion, but what he does do is write 32 books about his own religious journey, his visions and dreams of religion and God and whatnot. And one of these books is Conjugal Love. And this is why I wanted to touch on this book. I find it fascinating because this copy we have is printed in 1796. So it's actually quite a bit earlier of a text, but this is, an American version copied in English, 1796. And it's kind of buck wild for its time period. Conjugal love, in the broadest strokes, is Emanuel Swedenborg's idea about marriage and love and, oh goodness, how man and women being married and sort of being together, there might come points in which your wife doesn't like you very much. And therefore, it is good and okay to go get a mistress, just so long as it's sex only. You should not be romantically involved with your mistress. It should just only be sex, because if a man does not have sex, he will get sick and die. Now, what's also very interesting is it's not all bad news. He also has these, kind of progressive for his time ideas about women and what women are supposed to be bringing to a marriage. And the act of even having the idea that women might be bringing something important to marriage and something important into the lives of men is kind of novel in of itself. But it's a really funny book. It's a very funny book. And it's so interesting to me because in a modern context, so the Swedenborgian faith is still very much around today, but they experienced a split in the church in the late 1800s. And essentially, there is the general convention side and there is the general church side. They couldn't have picked more similar names. The general church side takes a very literal reading of all 32 of Swedenborg's books. Very literal. Do not stray from the text. Whereas the general convention side is like, well, we can sort of adapt and take guesses at what he meant, because he didn't mean to start a religion anyways, so, what's the harm in sort of expounding upon this sort of, DLC, writing our own fan fiction. One of these big pieces of contention in the split of the church is conjugal love. The general convention side is looking at the general church side, and they're like, how do you take this book literally? It's crazy. It's this insane book. It's 230. This 230-year-old book is 521 pages originally. So all of Swedenborg's works are largely penned in Latin. So all of these English translations aren't quite perfect either. So even in translating it to English, there's a lot of hotly contested. Now you're trying to say we have to take everything he says literally, but you're already not taking it literally because you've sort of had to translate it, and there's imperfect translations. And so this book is really hotly contested, and it's still hotly contested today. The woman I was speaking with, Reverend Rosalind Taylor, she started an entire women's group within Swedenborgian circles. One of their main goals is sort of, how do we handle this really antiquated book from the perspective of a woman? Because I think what's really key in Swedenborgianism, what also sets it apart from other religions is, especially of the time, is the Swedenborg believed if you had a marriage that was right and good, you would keep being married in heaven. As a non-religious person, I was like, okay, what does that mean? But there's also a lot of denominations that sort of argue there are no marriages in heaven, that bureaucracy doesn't follow us. So Swedenborg, who's interestingly enough writing this book about his expertise in religion and marriage and how it works together and how important it is from both the man's perspective and the woman's perspective, as a bachelor. He himself never marries, but he's like writing this marriage self-help advice book, which it's so fascinating to me when we're thinking about, like, I know how you can keep your marriage in heaven. Take my word for it. A guy who never marries is just fascinating in and of itself.
And isn't Chapman himself a lifelong bachelor? He never marries?
He never marries. So there's a sort of understanding that he did intend to get married at one point, but that gets called off for whatever the reasons. She was considerably younger than him, and it's believed that like their marriage was sort of contingent or sort of a deal that was brokered between, her father and work Chapman was doing. And eventually what becomes of it is this girl falls in love with a boy her own age, and John Chapman's like, I don't really have an interest in getting involved in this drama. But, we also think about why no wife, why no kids? And it's like, well, no house.
Mm-hmm.
You're not quite a hot catch if you're like, hey, babe, want to be my wife and have my kids? And by the way, I'm always going to be walking around barefoot forever all across the states, and I probably won't see you. He never gets married, but he does have this belief following Swedenborg's writings that, like, I'll probably have a wife in heaven. I'm going to be married in heaven. He probably wasn't really feeling the pressure to go get married and have kids, because in his mind and his worldview, he's like, I've got all the time in the world. I'll just be married in heaven. Easy.
How did you guys come across this book?
So this book, I don't actually know where it comes from, but I know why we kept it. This was printed specifically by Francis Bailey in Philadelphia. Francis Bailey is one of the first new churchmen converts in America. He's a historically important but unsub figure. He's actually the printer for the Continental Congress.
Oh.
But on the side, he's printing this Swedenborgian material, and he's really into his faith, and that's super cool. And he's a neighbor of Benjamin Franklin, and they have these reading circles that, what a group of odd ducks I have to imagine is like Francis Bailey, printer of the Continental Congress, and like Benjamin Franklin sitting around translating Latin books about ghosts and spirituality from this mystic over in Europe who accidentally started a religion. Gosh, what to be a fly on the wall for that.
Mm-hmm.
What's so fascinating about this copy being printed by Francis Bailey is it actually starts with a disclaimer. I have the disclaimer if you want me to read it.
Yes,
I printed out
please.
so much stuff. Okay, so you open the book, And it's actually in great condition because it's published 1796, 54 years later. There's a note someone wrote in the front cover that says, hey, I love this book so much that I rebound it. So it's in great condition because someone rebound it in the 1850s. You open it up, and there's this apology on the title page called Preliminary Observations by the Translator. It says, the translator would not have taken the liberty thus to introduce a new expression and supplant an old one, without what appeared to him a sufficient reason, and such as will justify him in the opinion of discerning readers. His reason is this, that the author himself constantly uses the Latin term conjugiale in preference to conjuale, which, when yet the latter term is equally classical and appears alike expressive, and that the author did this intentionally and not of caprice, is evident from this consideration that in one particular passage, it is hoped this will be thought a sufficient apology for the translator's following his example, on account of its superior softness and expressiveness. So it's fascinating to me that we open the book and the first thing is this very modern preemptive damage control of hey, before any of you get in the comments, just know I had a reason for sort of mistranslating this or that because Latin is hard, so deal with it. It's kind of hilarious. What's also very interesting about this is I love Francis Bailey. I've got a historical crush on him. I think he's so cool. He's really popular. His printing press is going great. We also know it starts to lose its popularity. One of the reasons is because he switches from sort of publishing all of these Continental Congress and patriotic things about the New World to doing pretty much only Swedenborgian materials. Swedenborgianism is a pretty fringe religion at this point. So he falls into this niche category where he's not printing anything that people are really reading anymore. He's got a few smaller customers and that's it. What's really interesting about this artifact is it has a swash letter. A swash letter is a letter stylized in print. And what it has is it looks like the integral system, which is this long, curly F shape, but without the crossbar. This is called the medial S. The S we use today is the round S. The round S is still used. It's in the end of words, so hers, round S. But they'll still use this medial S at the beginning of words and before hyphens. And so before the 18th century, that's super standard practice. Reading any document, it looks like it says Foseful. And it's that says so special. They just were using this silly emoji for some reason. Well, it sort of dissolves because of the development of something called the Caslon typeface. So 1722, there is the Caslon typeface. And when I say Caslon typeface, we're sort of talking about ye old Times New Roman or Arial. This is the font you want everything to be written in because that's proper and professional. And that includes our Declaration of Independence is actually printed in Caslon typeface.
Oh, wow.
And by 1796, all of Caslon's new typefaces don't have this medial S anymore. They've gotten rid of it. It's no longer the standard practice. So when Caslon font becomes the most acceptable font, any printer worth their salt is going to go out as quickly as they can and buy the new stamps from the Caslon collection. By the mid-1790s, Caslon fonts are no longer using the medial S. Your documents shouldn't have the medial S either, sort of dissolving. But 1796, this first edition of Conjugal Love is printed, and it does have the medial S. What does this tell us about the state of the super popular, successful printing press? They're printing all this patriotic material. He's in the same reading circles as Benjamin Franklin. And then a couple years later, we're sort of led to believe either he's lost track of the hot new typefaces, or can he not afford the new typefaces? What does that tell us about telling us anything about the state of Bailey's printing press? One of the most important books to him personally. He's printing with outdated typefaces, I think is really interesting. But that's something that you approached me about the podcast, I was like, oh, is this my chance to talk about our copy of Conjunction Love?
Exactly.
This is my opportunity. Amazing.
Well, and the other opportunity that you took, I'm also very interested in. Spoon.
Or spoon.
Tell me about the spoon.
This is another thing that our whole job as curators sort of contextualize the items we're putting out to make people care about it, to make people interact with it. It's 6.5 inches long, and it's a pewter teaspoon. The bowl of the spoon, which you'd actually eat off of, is sort of like stippled and sculpted into this carving of an apple tree. Right off the bat, that tells us a story. This item was never meant to be used for eating. So moving forward, what does that leave us with? And my mind immediately goes to not so much our generation, not so much my parents' generation, but a lot of people I know's grandparents.
My grandma had 3 cases in our kitchen of all different spoons.
There was very much a time and era where people were collecting useless spoons.
Mm-hmm.
And there was like a cultural resurgence, and like everybody's grandma was collecting spoons. So we're led to believe this is like a collector's spoon. But what are they collecting it for? So I sort of get into the sort of theory behind the phrase, they were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Where does that come from? And the most notable spoon in England being the coronation spoon, of course. 1603, coronation of King James I. It's a literal spoon, which holds holy water, and the archbishop dips his finger into it to anoint the king. Wonderful. Now, culturally speaking, we're looking at 17th century England. Silverware doesn't come in until the 1700s. If you're going to dinner with someone, you're sort of expected to bring your own, like, mess kit, pretty much. So when we're talking about spoons, and there's sort of, therefore, a status symbol attached to spoons. Mm-hmm. If you're going to dinner with a noble family and you're expected to bring your own spoons, this is your chance to show off that you've got good spoons.
Bring out the fine china.
Exactly. You're bringing your fine china mess kit to your buddy's house. And so you would bring spoons that were like, pewter was your upper middle class, and silver indicated you were really wealthy because you could afford to bring your mess kit made out of silver to your buddy's house. And then they become more intricate. And this sort of goes along with the archbishop and the coronation, is they sort of start coming out with apostle spoons, which are spoons which on the handle or on the bowl shows a picture of one of the apostles. And then that sort of evolves into saint spoons. And then the time frame gets kind of hazy. So some people are sort of citing that these spoons become popular gifts in the late 1400s, and that tradition dies out around the mid 1600s. But others are claiming it sort of carries on into the 20th century. And as your grandma can attest, some people are still very much into these collector spoons. Regardless, it becomes a practice that when a child is baptized, they should be gifted a silver or pewter spoon, usually by like a godparent, in order to set them on the right path in life. What's really interesting about these spoons is we're talking about apostle spoons, or we're talking about saint spoons. We have a Johnny Appleseed spoon. And so I sort of compared it to a 1490 spoon that the Met has in their collection. And the Met has basically gone back and forth, like, we think it's like 1490, and we're pretty sure that's supposed to be St. Jude on top. And our spoon is kind of almost identical to this spoon, but it's Johnny Appleseed on the top, which is just fascinating to me because we're talking about this character and his folklore and who he is and what he's become. We're sort of brushing into this hazy area of like, the same way we consider saints today is, yes, they were real people, but how literally do we want to take all of their miracles? And for some people, that answer is like incredibly literally, and that's awesome. And for some folks, it's like, well, let's take some liberties here and understand that when we're talking about this miracle, what they probably meant was he didn't walk 200 miles. They probably meant he walked like 20. Is sort of that walking back and finding the truth in the details. This is not the first time Johnny Appleseed is elevated to this idea of this like sainthood. Someone does call him the patron saint of American orchards. Neil Gaiman is calling him an American god. And you yourself have cited an article which is very popular, sort of equates him to an American Dionysus. This is not the first or last time that Johnny Appleseed would be sort of like looked at with that raised eyebrow. And so it's such a little artifact, but I believe that little artifacts can also tell really big stories without saying anything. I find this spoon fascinating.
Oh, well, it's a very special spoon, so it worked out great.
Thank you.
You guys must do some pretty fun events at the museum, I'm guessing, too.
So it's a bit of a loaded question there. So we have the museum, and historically speaking, our museum is operating under the umbrella of Urbana University. So all of these events and all this stuff was sort of also working with the college. And then the COVID-19 pandemic hits, and Urbana University permanently closes.
Oh.
That leaves our museum, which is staffed by the college and run by like college interns on one of the college campus buildings. We're sort of in a lurch. We buy a building, we go independent, which was crazy, but it's obviously worked out for us, which is wonderful. But so this is our first we're staring down the barrel at our first year operating by ourselves.
Oh, very exciting.
It's been so rewarding. But this September especially, I think I said at the top, this would be his 250th birthday. So as you can imagine, my September calendar is crazy. And we're just trying to, right now we're sort of working on ingratiating ourselves with different school age groups, bringing in a lot of kids and that hands-on experience, because I don't want other future kids to have the same idea of John Chapman that I did, which is like, Johnny Appleseed, that's the guy who gets me out of math class. Sort of introducing the importance of John Chapman. And this year especially, we're sort of trying to get involved with all these different events and festivals and Johnny Appleseed hot spots. So his birthday is on the 28th, which is a Saturday. Our town where we're located, Urbana, Ohio, does a hoopla parade and chili cook-off. We are also throwing Johnny Appleseed a birthday on that day. We're going to be in the parade, and while people are like, have their chili and whatnot, we're inviting them to like, come to the museum, hang out. We've got these beautiful yards, this beautiful side yard, beautiful backyard. We have a Johnny Appleseed descendant orchard. Come see our nasty little apples. Come sit in our grass. Come watch the deer. Party it up with us and celebrate this guy who's kind of, for all intents and purposes, withstands the test of time. We're hoping next year, 2025, we can set a more predictable schedule of events like museums all across the nation. That's our annual this and our annual that. But we're still really new to this whole space.
Well, it sounds like you guys are well on your way, and I'm excited to see where you guys take it. And thank you so much for meeting with me and being willing to share the true Johnny Chapman Appleseed.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was really a delight.
Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Curator's Choice, a Mighty Oak Media production. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and rating the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you love a museum and would like to hear it featured in an episode, shoot me a message at curatorschoicepodcast@gmail.com. I'll do my best to reach out and see if I can get them to be on the show. You can also view articles, artifacts, and more by following us on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for listening to Curator's Choice, a podcast for history nerds and museum lovers.